Welcome back to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. I'm Ryan.
And I'm Brian.
And this is the Bible Bistro. What is it, Brian?
It's a podcast all about the Bible, theology, and things related to the Christian faith. You know, I went and looked at our website the other day. By the way, we have a website. You can find us at thebiblebistro.com.
Yes.
There's a Patreon link there at the top. If you like what we do, you can sign up there. There's a sign up for newsletter. There's all kinds of things you can do
and
there.
Thank
you
you
can
to
look
those
at
who have sponsored us so far.
Absolutely.
Yes,
so
we
thankful.
appreciate that monthly support.
Yeah, and it helps us do what we're doing. But anyway, I went and looked, and I didn't realize you'd put there. That's our actual tagline. I thought you just made that stuff up off the top of your head. So I apologize for all the times that I tried to correct you from what you
I wasn't
had
just saying it just to say it. Yeah, I put it as like a tagline. Like, people have to know what this is about.
I thought you just made it up. I didn't know. So anyway.
You know what? I got accused of that as it was a joke the other day. We were talking about, I was part of a men's Bible study the other day.
Right.
And we're talking about Egypt and things that had happened, a lot of stuff.
Right.
And they're like, this one guy said, this is not to bolster me up anyway. This one guy said, oh, Ryan knows all this stuff about this stuff. The other guy goes, I think he just makes it up half the time. And he just passes it off as confidence.
I always say that. I say, hey, I make up about having to check me out. You know, that makes people dig in a little bit. So,
well,
anyway.
that's what you always said at the beginning when we're reading these hard names in the Bible. Just say it like you know what it actually means and just let it ride. So
right.
Here we are.
Speaking of hard names, now we're in Daniel 11. So.
Yes. But anyway, so yes, you can go to our website, thebiblebistro.com. Upper right-hand corner, there's a button there to support us. We are actively, I know I've said this before in the past, we are actively working on a refresh of the website. We're trying to bring in the YouTube videos in there as well to make it a resource for all that stuff. So we can because we reference some books and some things that are going on. And so trying to make it more of a...
If you watch us on YouTube, you can see how the different kinds of plaid that we wear. So
yes, the many, Dolly Parton's got her coat of many colors. I've got my closet of many plaids. So you can, we're actively working on refreshing that to bring the YouTube in there. So we've got the episodes really easy to get to. And then some of the extra resources. Brian and I were just talking about maybe producing some new stuff as well. Sure. So we trying to make that website a little bit more for you. But go ahead and check us out there if you'd like.
Well, and thanks also to those who've said they like the Daniel episodes.
Yes.
Some people are really all about the series. Some people like the randomness of our usual randomness. But
and to one of our biggest fans, he said it was you, not me, that produced. Because I said, well, thanks for the shout out about something, and he's like, well, I should maybe do the shout out to Brian because he's the one that's doing the teaching. So our biggest fan also likes to give us a good ribbing
once in a while.
Yes.
If it were not for you, this podcast would not exist. So
yeah, take that, biggest fan.
So let's go ahead to Daniel 11:2. Go ahead and read that for me. Now, let me preface, because this is where we get into really kind of deep waters here. Daniel 11 and 12 get very specific about events that happened historically. And this is where people who have any problem with predictive prophecy really kind of get lost in Daniel. They're like, this has to be later than the events that are being recorded. Now, you get into a real problem because the way that we're going to present Daniel 11 and then into 12 next week is that this is really covering about a 600-year period from the time of Daniel himself at the beginning of this to the time of the coming of Jesus, and even we're going to go beyond that in chapter 12. And so it gets really hard because we have copies of the book of Daniel from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so, we're getting into this period of time that we have manuscript evidence that it is,
prior to some of these events.
And so this is where, again, for me, predictive prophecy isn't an issue because I believe God is able to, he does that. That's part of what prophets do. Now I understand prophets also have, and they first and foremost speak to their own time. But we also see in Isaiah, for example, some very specific prophecies about the coming of Jesus, for example, or even Jesus' death. And so, anyway, just thought I would start out with that.
Yeah.
I'm going to go ahead and say this is a long chapter. There's a lot of history. Again, we're almost 600 years of history we're going to be talking about. And so So I'm going to try to make this as clear as possible. But we're not going to necessarily read every verse in this chapter. So I would encourage you to go back later and read Daniel chapter 11 after you've listened to this, or if you are not, I don't know, mowing your lawn or walking the dogs or raking the leaves or whatever, maybe follow this one. This one might be one you want to open your Bible next to. So
yeah, there's a lot happening here. I mean, there's even earlier stuff. There's a lot happening, but this is a whole new level of a lot happening, and I think this is where some of the historical, at least for me growing up, this is where some of our historical knowledge is lacking.
Sure.
Because we don't understand all the things that are happening,
Right.
and that this history does. We don't need anything more than the Bible, but also understanding world history also helps inform what's happening in these passages.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think we need to understand that stuff. So anyway, go ahead and read Daniel 2 for me, or Daniel chapter 11, verse 2 for me.
Have you had coffee today?
I only had one cup. I was trying to rush and get here. I should have picked up some coffee,
all right.
but I've only had one cup, so it's only going to be about. You're only going to get 1 cup full today. So
okay, here we go.
It's better than no coffee, but it's not quite my full caffeinated.
Not your full level. All right, here we go. Daniel chapter 11, verse 2. Now then, I tell you the truth. 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and then a 4th, who will be far richer than all the others. When he has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece.
So this vision, as we've seen already, is during the reign of Cyrus. You might remember last week. Go back and listen to last week's if you haven't listened to it yet. These are to be done in order, by the way. But last week we saw this was in the 3rd year of the reign of Cyrus. Remember, Cyrus allowed in his first year the captives in Judea who wanted to go, captives in Persia who wanted to go back to Judea were able to do so. So this is the 3rd year of the reign of Cyrus. So he's saying that there are 3 more kings who will arise. If we look historical, then we're talking about Cambyses, who reigned from 530 to 522 BC, Smerdis, who was just there for short. What?
Smerdis? I don't know. It's a funny name.
You can maybe, if you're going to have a child, Smerdis. I don't know. And then
such a Smerdis.
And then Darius the Great, not the earlier Darius, but Darius the Great, 521 to 486 BC. That would make the 4th king Xerxes, and it fits with what we see of the description here we're going to look at in just a minute, but he would have reigned from 486 to 465. He had a long, significant reign. He was able to, he accumulated a great deal of power. This is the same Xerxes, by the way, that is called Ahasuerus in Esther, in the book of Esther. If you look at Esther 1:1, for example, and also he's mentioned in Ezra 4:6. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and let me see if I can find this quickly. I'm going to go ahead. You stay in Daniel 11. I'm going to go over to Esther 1, because this describes the extent of Ahasuerus's. I always have a hard time saying that. Can you say that again? No, Ahasuerus. I actually looked it up because I've wondered before. The UE together sometimes is way, and sometimes it makes the sound way, and sometimes it's ue. But
I just wanted to try to force you to stumble over it again. I don't care. I just wanted to hear you stumble over it.
We say Xerxes. There's just no X's in Hebrew, so they say Ahasuerus. So this is Esther 1:1. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces. Now listen to this, stretching from India to Cush. Cush is the Cushites. That's North Africa is what we're talking about there. So Egypt in that Libya in that area, and so we're talking from the Indus River, from what is the borders of modern day India. So across Mesopotamia, across what we would call, today Jordan and Iran, and then of course the Promised Land down into Egypt is what Xerxes is ruling. So he was able to expand his empire. So Xerxes, we'll go ahead and then let read verses 3 and 4 then for me back in Daniel 11. Let me see if I can get back there. So
then a mighty king will arise who will rule with great power and do as he pleases. After he has risen, his empire will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 winds of heaven. It will not go to his descendants, nor will it have the power he exercised, because his empire will be uprooted and given to others.
Okay, so we talked about this before, and we've seen it at least two other ways, but when, about the Diadochoi, Alexander the Great, and those who follow. But I wanted to come back to Xerxes and just say this, that this one who will rise, this fourth king who will rise and rule his own kingdom with great power, the connection here is Xerxes attacks the Greek homeland, because he controls this large area. So he attacks the Greek homelands because of an earlier defeat, and this is all from the historian Herodotus. And this then, here's the connection, even though we're talking about not immediately following, but Alexander the Great then is the next thing we're going to talk about. His incursion against Persia really comes as a result of Xerxes' attacking Greece. So in response to that, 100 and some years later, Alexander comes with his army basically to make sure that they're the ones who are in control of this area of the world. And so that's what I think is the connection. It skips almost a century between verses 2 and verses 3, but the connection is that Xerxes' attack on Greece is what spurs Alexander, so to speak, to go toward Persia. Now, this word might here is interesting. I spent a little bit of time on this because this is a word that is often used to describe mighty here, this mighty king. Some of your translations will talk about a warrior king, and that word might is talking specifically about military might. And so that's a word that sometimes is used. In fact, I spent probably too much time on it for this short thing I'm going to say, but it's often used for warriors, that the cognates of this word. And so this is talking about his military might. So he's going to be a mighty king. It doesn't mean in terms of his political power or whatever. It's talking about military might. And this is what we see with Alexander and his armies, comes specifically and is able to take over this part of the land. But as we've seen, and remember, we've seen this already in Daniel. We've seen at least two other times talking about this great king. Remember the one horn on the goat, and then it breaks off at the height of his power, and 4 inferior kings arise, or 4 other horns grow up. And so this is talking about that period then of the Diadochoi. That's what's going to be the primary concern of chapter 11. We're going to have all this talk about the kings of the north and the kings of the south. And we've talked before. Go back and listen to our earlier episodes to talk about the Diadochoi, all 4 of these generals who took various parts of Alexander's empire. But the 2 that we are specifically concerned about, the kings of the north, are going to be
Seleucids.
The Seleucids. They're the general's name was Seleucus, and that he was a general of Alexander. He's the one who takes over basically parts of Mesopotamia and Syria, so just to the north of the Promised Land. And then the other one is going to be
the Ptolemies.
The Ptolemies. And so that's
wait. Is it Ptolemies or I keep the P silent?
You say Ptolemy. Well, you're speaking English and I'm speaking Greek.
Southern Indiana. Oh, I thought you said Greek. I thought you were going to say Southern Indiana.
In Greek, it would be Ptolemy. It would you pronounce the P.
Every consonant is pronounced in Greek.
So
right?
pterodactyl.
Okay, got it. No, that's Southern Indiana.
I'm just reporting the news. You can do what you want with it.
All right. Here we go.
But yeah, we use a Ptolemaic Egypt, but I mean, technically in Greek it is Ptolemy and Ptolemaic. So now I'm going to get all the letters of correction, but you pronounce every consonant. So Ptolemy is the general of Alexander who goes down into Egypt. He was smart because Egypt is very, how to say, it's hard to conquer. And so he takes over this area that's going to really, his family, and this is what we're going to be talking about for the next several hundred years, is going to be ensconced in Egypt. They're going to be, it's almost impossible to uproot them out of that. So the kings of the north and the kings of the south, go ahead and read verse 5 for me. And I actually had you look at something in the original languages earlier this week that I had noticed here, but
yeah. The king of the south will become strong, but one of his commanders will become even stronger than he and will rule his own kingdom with great power. You want to keep going?
No, that's just that verse right now.
Yeah.
So we have this idea of the kings of the south and the kings of the north. And what I had you do is I had you look up, and in the Septuagint, interestingly enough, so the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. In the Greek translation, it doesn't say king of the south here, but I had you look it up, and what does it say? It says,
and he will strengthen the dominion of Egypt.
Egypt. Okay, so the south, we're talking in relation to the Holy Land. South is Egypt, and then north is Syria. So that's we call it Syria. I mean, even though the Seleucids control more than just Syria, that we call it, because in relation to the Promised Land, it's the kings of the north and the kings of the south. So the Seleucids and the Ptolemies basically are fighting over this area of land for the next several hundred years, and it reminds us again of how important of an area the Holy Land is, because it is a land bridge, we mentioned before, between these two major continents. You can't come across the great desert, and so you come up from Egypt across up the coast, and you need to cut across this mountainous region in the center of the Holy Land. You've got to cut across through the Valley of Jezreel in order to get over into the other major superpowers of this period of time, which is whoever controls Mesopotamia. So the Seleucids, who control Mesopotamia, and the Ptolemies, who control Egypt, this land is that's the meeting point. The Promised Land is the meeting point of those two great empires, and so it's no wonder they're going to be battling back and forth over this. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So verse 5, it says that there's a commander of one of the kings of the south. And so this is a reference to Seleucus, who initially was a general of Ptolemy and worked with Ptolemy initially. But then after Ptolemy had taken Egypt, Seleucid asked for his help in defeating Syria, but then eventually Seleucus, and I'm talking about the person here, not just the dynasty, Seleucus eventually rebels against Ptolemy and tries to defeat him. So that's what's all being referred to in verse 5. And so Seleucid, as it mentions here, Seleucus ends up exceeding Ptolemy's power because he extends his reign really back to the Indus River. So essentially, it was that part of Alexander's empire that he had chosen as his capital that Seleucus initially is the one who's in control of.
Okay, so I just want to rewind this. So you've got the Seleucid kingdom on the north. You got the Ptolemies in the south, but yeah. Seleucus,
the general,
before he established the one in the north, is just just under the Ptolemies,
a general, and that's what's being talked about in verse 5.
Before he rebels and goes to the north,
and so then he asked for help from Ptolemy to take Syria, and initially they worked together, but then eventually Seleucus's power really becomes greater than Ptolemy's because he extends from Syria. I mean, I said Egypt was a really smart move because it's very difficult to uproot them, but also there's not a lot of expansion.
Yeah, you're kind of isolated down there.
And so he extends to all the way to the Indus River. So that's what's going on here. Does that all make sense? Am I
clear as mud? Yes. No. Well, I think the thing is,
it's hard to follow.
Like I already thought the North. I thought they'd already split at this point.
Right.
But no, that
it all took place
and
relatively
Ptolemy,
quickly.
are together, and then they go up to get Syria, and then Seleucus is like, "Get out of here, it's mine."
And then he takes over even more. He becomes greater in power. And here's the other thing that makes this all confusing to talk about. As I've mentioned to you before, none of these people were very creative when it came to coming up with names for their children.
Yeah, Seleucus II.
Right, and so it's basically the Seleucid Empire is made up entirely of Seleucus or Antiochus, and the Ptolemies only used the name Ptolemy, so it's it gets a little confusing.
Ptolemy, and like 5 people turn around and say, "What?"
Well, they all end up with nicknames too, which I didn't really get into because that even makes it more confusing. But anyway, we'll try to keep it all straight. So look at verse 6 then.
Okay, I'm looking at it.
Read it, please. Yeah, thank you.
After some years, they will become allies. The daughter of the king of the south will go to the king of the north to make an alliance, but she will not retain her power, and he and his power will not last. In those days, she will be betrayed together with her royal escort and her father and the one who supported her.
So this is not referring to the original Ptolemy and Seleucus. And really what you have as we look down through here is we're going to have 4 kind of vignettes that take place where the kings of the south and the kings of the north are in some kind of relationship to one another. And the first is what we saw with the general that then becomes greater and has a greater empire in the eventually. This is a reference then to Ptolemy II, who's the son of Ptolemy I, and Antiochus II. So Antiochus II is the Seleucid king, and Ptolemy II is the Ptolemaic king at this period of time. King of Egypt, king of Syria. Let's call it that way.
We're on the deuces now.
Right. So Antiochus II, Ptolemy II. Ptolemy's daughter was Bernice. And I know you're going to say Bernice, but again, let's pronounce it.
I mean,
Bernice.
I like to call her I'd like to think of her as a Bernice.
Bernice, but that's it. Well, never mind. You don't care. But she was married to Antiochus II, and they had a child together. So this is what that's talking about. That alliance that was an attempt to make an alliance between the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid Empire. But after they had the child, and after a couple of years, Antiochus II left or put her away and ended up marrying another woman. And so that dissolved that, that alliance. What really then is kind of, there's a lesson here someplace, but basically Antiochus II was then assassinated by his new wife. This
is Proverbs. There's some Proverbs about this.
So he's assassinated. Bernice and the son are also killed during this period of time, assassinated by some other people. And so what happens next then is that the ones who come to the throne after this then, well, go ahead and read verses 7 through 10, because this is going to describe this.
Yeah, this isn't easy. I mean, this is drama.
Dude, it is. And again, we're spanning several hundred years, a lot of kingdoms, kind of kings arising and falling and so forth.
One from her family line will arise to take her place. He will attack the forces of the king of the north and enter his fortress. He will fight against them and be victorious. He will also seize their gods, their metal images, and their valuable articles of silver and gold and carry them off to Egypt. For some years, he will leave the king of the north alone. Then the king of the north will invade the realm of the king of the south, but will retreat to his own country. His sons will prepare for war and assemble a great army.
You've gone too far. Where are you at?
No,
what verse are you
I was on 10.
Oh, were you? Okay, I apologize then. Okay, because we're going to talk about that in a minute. I apologize.
Easy.
I should have said through 9 probably, but
okay, well then I'll stop. We'll stop.
We'll get to it. So the one who is going to arise from her own line is a reference to her brother, whose name is, any guesses?
Ptolemy.
Ptolemy the third.
Well, the third at this point.
So Bernice's
Ptolemy
brother
cubed, right?
Yeah. Just like L cubed.
Yeah.
So Ptolemy the third is the brother of Bernice, and so he goes up in order to avenge her death, basically. And he's able to eventually capture the people who assassinated her and her son, and he has them executed. And it talks about something about their gods. What did it say about that? That he's during this period of time able to. I'm sorry. That's fine. What he does is he captures some Syrian.
He will seize their gods, their metal images, and their valuable articles of silver and gold, and carry them off.
He captures some of the Syrian idols out of the temples up there while he's there, and brings them back down to Egypt. Way to kind of show his power and his significance there, and so that's what happens there. Then the next thing, and you're beginning to read about this, there's 2 brothers now that arise. And this is where it gets to where, and I know all this has been kind of quick, but this is where it begins to really become important for our, to see how this all developed, essentially, the kings of the north and the kings of the south.
Okay. How about I start with 9, because it talks about the king of the north.
Sure. Go ahead and do that.
Then the king of the north will invade the realm of the king of the south, but will retreat to his own country. His sons will prepare for war and assemble a great army, which will sweep on like an irresistible flood and carry the battle as far as his fortress.
Okay, so let's stop there for just a moment. Seleucus III and Antiochus III. I'm not making this up.
Oh, wait. They're two brothers. Seleucus
They're brothers.
III. Okay.
Seleucus III and Antiochus III are brothers. Okay.
Seleucus Trip.
And they begin to increase the power and of their dynasty, and specifically Antiochus III worked with the people of Judea. So he worked with the Jews, and what they were trying to do is that they were trying to overthrow Ptolemaic rule. So that's why the Jews were willing to work with the Syrians at this point, because the Egyptians during this entire period of time, the Ptolemies during this entire period of time, had control over the Holy Land. So the people of Jerusalem are going, oh, this is great. We've got these people from the north, the kings of the north who are coming, and they're going to help us overthrow Ptolemy. What they did not realize, and what they soon found out, however, what was the Who song? Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. That what we have happening here is that the Seleucids are not going to be any better than the Ptolemies, and in fact, we're going to find eventually they are worse than the Ptolemies that the Jews worked with in order to overthrow. What's important here is that Antiochus III works with the people of Judea in order to overthrow them, and this is going to cause some difficulties later on. So we're talking now right around 200 BC. In that period of time is where we find ourselves. By this time, then, after that defeat of the Egyptians, the next king arises, and he's actually, his father's killed when he's relatively young. He takes the throne. His name, any guesses? King of the South.
Let me guess. Ptolemy?
Ptolemy the Fifth. Okay, Ptolemy the Fifth is a child king. Then he takes the throne at 5 years old. And again, that shows us a little bit about the strength of the Syrians at this period of time in relation to the strength of Ptolemy. So the Seleucids are more powerful during this time. They're able to extend their rule down into the Holy Land. And, again, with the help of the Jewish people, they're able to kick the Ptolemies out. So what Antiochus III then wanted, and I'm going to say this, Antiochus III had lots of ambition. He really wanted to establish himself over all of Alexander the Great's old empire. So he tried to take Egypt then by making a political alliance. And so he sent his daughter, and we're going to read about this again. Let's not read these verses, but read down through verse 20, verses 11 through 20. Not you, but if you at home, if you want to know what we're talking about here, read verses 11 through 20, and you're going to see again how specific these connections are between the scripture and what happened historically. But Antiochus III sent his daughter down to marry Ptolemy V. Now, Antiochus III's daughter was named, drumroll please, Cleopatra.
Oh,
it's not that
Cleopatra.
No, this is Cleopatra the First.
Okay,
you're thinking about Cleopatra the Seventh.
Oh,
have I mentioned that these people were not very creative when it came up with naming their children?
Well, you know what I meant. The Cleopatra that 6 generations later would become Cleopatra that we know about.
The whole
Egypt.
Cleopatra Mark Antony. She is Cleopatra the Seventh. It has to do, Patra is the word for father. It has to do with the gods of the father, follower of the gods of the father, or something to that effect. But anyway, Cleopatra the Seventh is the one you're thinking of. This is Cleopatra number one.
First. Yeah. Wait, what's the age difference here we got now? Because if Ptolemy the Fifth is like 5.
Wait, we haven't. You're giving away what's coming next, because he is 7 years old when Cleopatra the First is sent down to marry him. So they delay this for 5 years. They delay the marriage for 5 years until he's 12, and so
that's what it does.
Right. Talk about drama.
Yeah.
So, but again, it's a political marriage, right?
Right.
So And I tell you, it gets better. You're not going to believe what happens. So Antiochus III sends his daughter Cleopatra the first down to marry Ptolemy the fifth. He gets to be of age. He gets to be 12 years old. They marry. And so then remember why had Antiochus III done this? In order to politically control Egypt. But the problem is that his daughter on every issue takes the side of her husband.
It's probably because she's mad. I'm going to guess. Like, you sent me down here to marry a child.
It could be that she's down there for a period of time too. I think she may become sympathetic to the people. She becomes connected to the people. You know, she's been down there for 5 years before the marriage even takes place. So he's thwarted from being able to take over Egypt. So now he does control the Holy Land at this period of time, Antiochus III. So here's what really becomes interesting is he decides that he's going to Antiochus III. Now think this is really important. Hold on to this. Antiochus III decides to expand westward. Again, he's trying to take over all of Alexander's old area. He attacks, eventually he attacks the islands along the Mediterranean, but he eventually goes to attack the Greek homeland. And he is thwarted in that. He's expelled. And actually, they drive him back into Asia Minor, and he's defeated in Asia Minor as well by a group that has arisen from even further west who are known to us as the Romans. So the Romans are now on the scene. They're the ones who now control Greece. Part of what happens when he goes back into Asia Minor, if you can imagine that on a map from Greece, his son, Antiochus III's son, whose name is Antiochus IV, who's going to become very important for us later.
They don't have baby books back then, baby name books.
They did. They were just only one page. But
with one name on it. What are we going to name this one? Antiochus.
Flip a coin.
Yeah.
Well, and Antiochus's brother's name was Seleucus.
Good.
But we'll get to that in a minute. So Antiochus, who's going to be known as Antiochus Epiphanes, just to give away the end of the story. So Antiochus III's son is taken as a hostage by the Romans after they defeat Antiochus III, and he is taken back to Rome for 12 years. So he's taken as a captive. And I think, again, when we get to Antiochus IV and we see his ruthlessness, we see just the things that he does, I think this is what happens. Antiochus III then, so this is Antiochus IV's dad. Antiochus III is killed in 187 BC. So his son, not Antiochus IV, but Seleucus IV, succeeds him. And then, after Antiochus IV comes back, Seleucus IV dies under mysterious circumstances. We think he was probably poisoned
Dun, dun, dun. Yeah.
by Antiochus IV, who then takes the throne. Antiochus IV Epiphanes then takes the throne and becomes center to this whole period of time. Now,
and he's a Roman. Is he a Roman installment then at this point?
He's learned, I think, from the Romans. The Romans are not yet concerned with this part of the world.
They're still grinding it out further
They're heading
west.
this way. Now again, let's go back to what we've talked about before, just to kind of set the stage for this. When we have Alexander the Great and his conquest pictured, it's always these fast, he moves across the entire unknown world quickly. Right, like a goat.
It's a real quick sweep.
Like a goat with four wings whose feet doesn't touch the ground, right? Or leopard with bird's wings. He's fast and he takes it quickly and doesn't consolidate it. You said grinding, and that's the word I usually use for this. The Romans, on the other hand, they take their territory in a slower pace, but they are able to consolidate it. And that's why we have the Roman Empire existing as long as it does, I think, is because they were able to enforce peace, I guess, enforce their rule over their entire kingdom. So it's a different animal. He's a different beast. You see what I'm saying? Is they're able to grind that out. Questions. So we've gone through a lot right now. We're getting ready to get into some really important stuff. But anything to this point that you have questions about, or is it all clear? Or
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's clear. It's clear. I mean, this is, I think this is why the history is important, to see this stuff. And it's oftentimes, if again, this is not where I'm not shorting the Bible in any way, shape or form here, but like the importance of understanding the world history of what's happening, what's going on here. Because I think if we don't, we can get all kinds of crazy things out of this. But to see that, like, how this plays out is really interesting. What's going on there? Because again, we don't. But if you don't have this information, you're like, well, what is happening here, and what is this? What is this supposed to mean?
Right.
So no questions. I'm thinking as I read this, if we're when you were talking about the Judeans shook off the Ptolemies and took on the Seleucids, and they weren't any better.
Right.
I keep thinking, gosh, man, they're probably thinking back to Deuteronomy, like, man, if we had just listened the first time, we wouldn't be. You're shaking off, shaking off one to take on another tyrant, and it's just you're going back and forth, but. Just that idea of like, I was thinking about the blessings and curses of Deuteronomy again, and kind of going like, this curse has the long-standing, how long they've lived through turmoil because of choices. So anyway, that's
so.
All
let me read a little bit. I said we weren't going to read all this. Let me read just a little bit of Daniel 11, starting in verse 16. Again, just kind of set the stage and kind of make clear what we're talking about here. The invader, and this is talking about Antiochus III, the invader will do as he pleases. No one will be able to stand against him. He will establish himself in the beautiful land. The beautiful land is talking about the Holy Land here. And he will have the power to destroy it. He will determine to come with the might of his entire kingdom and will make an alliance with the king of the south, and he will give him a daughter in marriage. So that's Cleopatra I being married to Ptolemy V in order to overthrow the kingdom, but his plans will not succeed or help him. Then he will turn his attention to the coastlands and will take many of them. This is where we talk about him moving toward the west and turning his attention there. But a commander will put an end to his insolence and will turn his insolence back on him. After this, he will turn back toward the fortresses of his own country, but will stumble and fall. This is his death in 187, and be seen no more. Verse 20, his successor will send out a tax collector to maintain the royal splendor. In a few years, however, he will be destroyed, yet not in anger or in battle. And so that's where we historically, it seems that he was probably poisoned by Antiochus IV. So verses 21 through 24 now are the rise of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who succeeds his brother Seleucus IV. He'll be succeeded by a contemptible person who has not been given the honor of royalty. He will invade the kingdom when its people feel secure, and he will seize it through intrigue. That's probably, again, that idea of a poisoning. Then an overwhelming army will be swept away before him. Both it and the prince of the covenant will be destroyed. Probably a reference to the high priest, right? The leaders of that. And after coming to an agreement, or a covenant is actually the word that you'll see in some of your translations, probably a better translation. After coming to a covenant with him, he will act deceitfully, and with only a few people he will rise to power. When the richest provinces feel secure, he will invade them and will achieve what neither his fathers nor his forefathers did. He will distribute plunder, loot, and wealth among his followers. He will plot the overthrow of fortresses, but only for a time. So this goes back then to what we've seen in previous chapters. In chapter 7 of Daniel, and also in chapter 10. What it talked about then is that at this point is when that abomination that brings desolation will be set up in the temple, that he will be the one who overthrows the Jewish people. And again, part of this is because they resisted him. After they begin to see how his father had been, Antiochus III, and now how he is as he comes in, they begin to resist this, and Antiochus IV isn't going to have any of that. So when they begin to resist him, he utterly destroys, he tries to wipe out Judaism. And then we've seen the Maccabees. Obviously, we've talked about them before doing that. So
is he coming in with an army against his brother? Or is
he when he takes over from his brother, so his dad's Antiochus III, right? He's the king. He's the one who has the army.
Dad's dead.
Yeah.
Seleucus the Fourth gets.
So he controls the army.
Mm-hmm. And then we think that Antiochus comes back and it's like, oh, my brother, and then a little bit
have
of
a Coke, right?
Yeah, a little cyanide or whatever they do. Kills him, and then then they elevate him. He
becomes the king.
Okay.
And then through intrigue, and then so the army belongs to him. His father had
then he's
built.
Just like, all right, I'm going to do what I want to do now.
Exactly. And so you remember his dad wanted to take Egypt? Well, guess what he wants to do? He wants to take Egypt as well. Mm-hmm. So he goes down and he tries to take it by force. He's unsuccessful. They're able to repel him. When he comes back then, and here's what's happening. Here's what goes on. Let me read this then, verses 25 through 30. With a large army, he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south. So Egypt, right? Mm-hmm. The king of the south will wage war with a large and very powerful army, but he will not be able to stand because of the plots devised against him. Those who eat from the king's provisions will try to destroy him. His army will be swept away, and many will fall in battle. The two kings, with their hearts bent on evil, will sit at the same table and lie to each other, but to no avail, because an end will come at the appointed time. The king of the north will return to his own country with great wealth, but his heart will be set against the Holy Covenant. Now, basically what happened is when he's repelled there in Egypt, he takes it out on Judea, because that's the way back home, right? You know, he went down through Judea in order to try to take Egypt. When he is repelled, he goes back into Judea, and this is where we see him going into the temple and taking the articles out and beginning to take his actions against the Holy Land, against Jerusalem specifically.
Okay.
And
let me ask you a question. Okay. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
This is probably, if you're just listening, this is probably a good time to have your Bible open for this. But back in verse 22, it says that an overwhelming army swept away before him. Who is that army that swept away?
I'd have to look. I honestly don't know.
Okay,
off the top of my
anyway,
head. I think
a prince of the covenant will be destroyed. So has he already killed the high priest when he first takes power, or is this kind of like a foreshadowing of what's coming?
I think this is him. Killing the high priest when he takes power. And
the high priest of Judea.
Of Jerusalem.
Okay,
right.
Jerusalem. Okay.
Right. And the army, I don't know if that would be a reference to Egypt or not. That would be my guess. I'll have to look. We'll answer that next week.
Well, I was more concerned about the high priest. Like if he killed the high priest before he waged war in the south,
right?
Before he waged war with Egypt, and then he's still like, I didn't like them, that's why I killed them, and then now he's coming back to.
And then he comes back, and he comes back with a vengeance. Basically, is what I'm trying to say here at this point, and has his heart set against the.
So he's mad. He's mad that he didn't get what he wanted in Egypt, and now he's like, I want to fight somebody that I know I can win.
Now, here's what's really interesting. In verse 29, it says, at the appointed time, he will invade the south again, but this time the outcome will be different from what it was before. Ships of the western coastlands, and there you're going to have different words sometimes that will be translated there. They will oppose him, and he will lose heart. So what happens is this is historically the second time that Antiochus IV tries to invade Egypt. He is met at the border by ships from Rome. And basically the ships from Rome say, stop it. And so he turns back. Well, and Rome at this point is increasingly powerful. Antiochus IV goes back, and you might remember then the Maccabees arise. So we have Mattathias and Judas Maccabeus and all that story we've told in a different place. But basically, this revolution against Antiochus IV, and the Syrians are trying to wipe out Judaism. Their revolution against Antiochus IV eventually is successful, and part of the reason is because Antiochus IV remembers what happened to his dad.
That's why he's mad at the South.
Well, but what I'm saying is Antiochus the third, remember, was repelled after he went into Greece. The Romans,
did it there.
Yeah, and
Pushed
so
him
he
back, and that's when took Antiochus the Fourth with him.
And so so he remembers all of that. And so what eventually happens now is Romans are coming. They press on his east or his western borders to the point that he no longer can worry about Judea. So after and that's what's so interesting to me about this whole thing is Judas Maccabeus and his followers are able to establish a Maccabean rule here for a period of time, but that's because the Romans are coming and the Syrians, again, let's think about and the Seleucids, let's call them at this point. The Seleucids are suddenly engaged in this much, much bigger battle with this Roman Empire, who again will eventually come and take over the Holy Land as well, but in a different way.
All right, so let's do a history rewind here. Can we do this? So Antiochus,
I'll try.
Okay, so I just want to.
Sure.
So Antiochus the Fourth, also called Antiochus Epiphanes, doesn't like the people. He tries to go to Egypt one time to take them, doesn't work. Comes back, it's like he's mad at Judeans, takes it out on them. Right?
Yep, that's
correct.
Exactly right.
Goes back again, has some success until he meets the Romans. And the Romans are like, hey, bro,
turn around,
go back. So then he comes back. That's when he desecrates the temple.
Yes.
Okay, so Antiochus is the Fourth. He's got a rage issue. He's an angry guy.
Well, that's why I wanted to go back and talk about what happened with his dad, right? And talk about the fact that he was taken by the Romans for 12 years as a hostage, That's going to mess you up when you're a kid.
His hostage takers are back, and they're right. And so he's like, I want to keep doing this, but you're saying no.
Yes.
So he comes back. That's when he desecrates the temple.
Yes.
And so then the Romans keep pushing, pressing against them.
Yeah.
And during the
period,
time
and remember that we know this period, right? It's time, 2 times and a half time, right? So it's 3.5 years that the temple is desecrated, and then Judas Maccabeus and his followers are able to go in on Hanukkah, right? On the
It's not Hanukkah until after.
Not yet, right? It's the 25th of December, though, is when they go in, and they're able to reestablish the sacrifice. They're able to light the menorah. They,
right. So Antiochus desecrates the temple. And then there's some from Judea, Judeans that rise up against them. And that's Judas Maccabeus.
Yeah, the Maccabees.
And then they're the ones that fight against Antiochus in Jerusalem, get the temple back. And the only reason they're able to do that is because Antiochus is concerned now that his one-time captors are now starting to take are putting pressure on him and probably going to destroy him.
And they eventually do. And we'll bring in the Romans here at the very, very end. And so we get to verses 36 through 39, and there's a little bit of a controversy about this. There are some people who think this may be a further description of Antiochus Epiphanes, but there are others, and I would put myself in this camp, who think this is actually a description of a different ruler who's going to come in and have an influence on the Holy Land, and particularly Judea during this period of time. And we told his story. I think I've talked about his story on here before. If not, we'll do a whole episode on it. But it's a guy that you may have heard of by the name of Herod the Great. And of course, we're getting, next week's Thanksgiving, or this week's Thanksgiving. Sorry.
Podcast time. This week is Thanksgiving. We're getting into Advent season. And, the Christmas story involves this guy, Herod the Great. And that's who I think we're talking about. Now, the interesting thing is Herod and his father had dealings with the Romans as well. No, he wasn't. His father was, I can never, there were different Herods, right? There was Herod Antipas. But anyway. We've been having a joke about children being named like their father. Okay.
But this is Herod the Great, Herod the Builder, sometimes called Herod the Baby Killer, because he's the one who we have the slaughter of the innocents in Matthew, that he was the one who was responsible for. But Herod is the one who who probably is being referred to here in verses 36 through 39. So read it, and I'll tell you why I think in just a minute. But go ahead and read verses 36 through 39 for me.
Right. The king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god and will say unheard of things against the God of gods. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed, for what has been determined must take place. He will show no regard for the gods of his ancestors or for the one desired by women, nor will he regard any god, but will exalt himself above them all. Instead of them, he will honor a god of fortresses, a god unknown to his ancestors. He will honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He will attack the mightiest fortresses with the help of a foreign god, and will greatly honor those who acknowledge him. He will make them rulers over many people, and will distribute the land at a price.
Now you might remember that part of Herod's he has this group that's close to him, who the Herodians, right? That's what we call them, the Herodians, who have their power because of Herod the Great. And we're talking about, again, in Judea, in the people, the Jewish people. So some people, again, think this is further description of Antiochus the Fourth. I think it's Herod, and here's the reason I think it's Herod, is because this next part, starting in verse 40, seems to be a description of the coming of the Romans. Oh, and this is what I was going to say. Both Herod and his father, you might remember, depended upon the Romans for their power.
Right.
Herod fled. You might remember his father had been appointed governor over Judea. There was an uprising against them. Herod and his father and his family had to flee to Rome. Herod there was appointed governor of Judea, or actually a king of Judea. He was the king of the Jews. And so he was sent back. Basically, they appointed him that, but then he had to go back and he had to squelch, I guess is the word I'm looking for. I don't know what quelch means, but look it up. But squelch this rebellion and exhibit control. And you know all the stories then about how Herod did that. He was a ruthless person when it came to this. Builder, he built great fortresses, but he established himself as the ruler over Judea during this period of time. But we're getting toward this very important period, right? Mm-hmm. So here's the reason I think this is Herod is what comes next, actually. And so it starts in verse 40. It says, at that time, the end of the king of the south will engage him in battle, and the king of the north will storm out against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships. He will invade many. You have to be really careful, by the way, if you're reading that quickly, to say fleet of ships, because if it comes out wrong, not that I've ever had that happen. But anyway, they will come out against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships. Now, who does that even sound like? Just think about that. Just hold on to that a minute. He will invade many countries and will sweep through them like a flood. He will also invade the beautiful land. Many countries will fall, but Edom, Moab, and the leaders of Ammon will be delivered from his hand. He will extend his power over many countries. Egypt will not escape. So finally, we're going to find that Egypt is itself going to be taken during this period of time. He will gain control over the treasures of gold and silver, riches of Egypt, with the Libyans and the Cushites in submission. But reports from the east and the north will alarm him, and he will set out with a great rage to destroy and annihilate many. He will pitch his royal tents between the seas at the beautiful holy mountain, yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. So that sounds a lot like the Romans coming with Herod's help in order to not only take the Holy Land, but also to extend their control down into Egypt as well. Mm-hmm. So that's what I think is going on during that part. That's why I think 36 through 39 is a reference to Herod.
Because of the chariots and cavalry and the great fleet of ships. I mean, that's Rome. That
seems to be Rome. Yeah. And that Egypt, historically, Egypt, is finally controlled by Rome as they come through to basically.
So let me ask you this question. So earlier we had Antiochus trying to take Egypt, and the Romans are saying like, no, don't do it.
Yeah.
So the Romans didn't take Egypt then at that point. They just
not
told
at that
him
point.
Yeah, they just told Antiochus like, turn around, tiger.
It was at that point they had sent a small fleet of ships. Basically, it was just a small envoy that went down to tell him to turn back. It was political force, not military force, that caused him to turn back the second time. If you get what I'm saying, it wasn't because they were superior in number at that point.
Right.
But where they are at this point is up in Asia Minor, pressing in, beginning to press in on his western borders. And so that's, they come around that way, if you will.
Right. They eventually work their way down to the south to take Egypt.
And they end up controlling the Mediterranean, which is going to be, if you're going to take Egypt, that's the way you've got to do it, right? You're going to have to control shipping lanes. You're going to have to control the Mediterranean, and they do all of that. So that was one of the problems Alexander had is not controlling a navy in the same way that Rome did. But
yeah. Well, I mean, he did pretty good for what he had.
He did better. I don't know, better. He did differently than anybody else had ever done. I mean, that's why we call him Alexander the Great. Right. He's not Alexander the so-so.
We wouldn't be talking about Alexander if he had been the mediocre Alexander.
Yeah. So again, what all this is setting up then, and again, it's remarkable when you look at the specificity of the events that are like the royal marriages, the defeats, and all of this. You understand why people go look at Daniel and go, this is got to be written after the fact, right? This is 2020 hindsight, but all this is remarkable, and all of it is leading toward, I think, what we saw earlier. Do you remember when we went back in 10 and Daniel is concerned for his people going back after the 70 years. Mm-hmm. And instead we have the 77s, right? And we have, look, I'm going to do something for you, your people, that is going to bring salvation in a different way. Mm-hmm. And this is an expansion of that story, I think, to talk about the coming of all the things that are going to happen before that, but then the coming of this one who is going to be the Savior, who is going to be the ultimate King. And since we mentioned this, and since I've kind of foreshadowed this already, look at what we have then in the beginning of chapter 12. It says, "At that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. There'll be time of distress such as not happened from the beginning of the nations until then. But at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt." So we're talking about, this is apocalyptic literature, right? And we're talking about this idea of, despite all these wars and this intrigue, these foreign kings, these invaders, right, who are trying to destroy God's people, that God's promise is that I'm bringing a kind of salvation that you can't even imagine, right? I'm going to raise the dead. We're going to have a different kind of salvation than you can even picture, is what's going to happen.
Yeah. Woo. A lot happening.
Yeah, so next week we should be able to finish up Daniel 12, and that'll be the end of the book of Daniel. So other questions, anything else that leaves you with? And I know there's some details. Well, I have to remember, I'll have to go back and listen to our episode to remember that one I said I would talk about next week. It was, yeah, I'll look for it. But
yeah, no, I think this is, trying to demystify some of it that seems to be, and again, the original hearers of this would have understood probably the history of how they got there. As much as some of it for us modern people, separated by 2,000 over 2,000 years, it's like, we don't know who that, rulers and so forth is, but like this,
the
this
original
is very clear
hearers, the original hearers of Daniel, I don't think this had experienced this yet, but the promise is God's basically saying, hey, there's a lot of war, there's intrigue, there are these evil kings who are going to seek to destroy you. I mean, that's the message, right? They're seeking to do away with God's people, but you need to hold fast to the promise that God is bringing a Savior, and He has an army on His side that is greater than, and is an unseen army, let's call it, that is greater than all the armies of this world, and that's what I think is the message He's getting across. But you're talking about like in the time of Jesus, for example, when He starts using this kind of language, or the time of John, when he starts to use the language of Daniel to express what's about to happen as well. Yeah, I think that's correct.
And it just, the message of Daniel through this is hold on. And I always say that we've made this correlation before I've tried to draw it, is the revelation that relies so heavily on that.
Right.
That takes some of this imagery is the message there is hold on.
The same way that God was able to deliver his people despite all these rising and falling empires, and just think about that, the message that gives us, these great, Rome, greatest empire on the face of the earth, right? Alexander the Great, this incredible conqueror, those guys have risen and fallen, and yet God's people continue, right? The kingdom of God will not falter. And that's I think the message that we need to get across. So,
well,
if I can make
ahead.
a little practical implication today, as much as we get concerned about wars and rumors of wars today, as Jesus would say, and the things that are happening, and what does all of this mean, that we believe and we have evidence to see that the kingdom of God shall not fall. Despite all these other things, that the kingdom of God continues. So
yeah, it's we always want to see ourselves as like, we're at the end of it, like we're
Right.
what I mean, like we're at the very end of it. But
Sure.
you think about, we talk about this as Daniel 11's covering a 600-year period.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people that live and die during this time.
That's right.
There's a whole generation that are living through the war and Antiochus Epiphanes and his murderous reign and desolation, abomination, desolation, that just like that might be the time that you're in.
Yeah.
And that you might live and die in that, but the promise of God still remains.
Yep.
And that's the message. Just like Daniel is praying to Jerusalem, knowing that there's the decree out there,
Yes.
like he is living faithfully in a context, not knowing where he's at in the timeline.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like,
That's right.
But knowing that the time, there is a time coming. There is a Savior
Right.
coming. There is a redemption coming, and
Right.
that our lot is to live in that, not just retreat from it, but to remain faithful through that.
I'm actually preaching this week. The title of my sermon is the coming of the Son of Man. And I had kind of a week between stuff, and we're going to do Thanksgiving next week, and then we're into Advent. So I'm using Matthew 25, and what's interesting there is there's a couple of stories that are told. Jesus tells a bunch of stories. He's talking about the end of the world in 24, and then in 25 he tells this parable of the wise and foolish virgins. You might remember it. The bridegroom's away for a long time, and they fall asleep, and the wise virgins have bought enough oil, right? And then the foolish ones haven't. And so they say, hey, give us some of your oil. And they're like, no, you need to go buy it. But all the places to buy oil are shut. And so the bridegroom's coming at a time that they don't expect, right? The next story is really interesting because it's that story of the talents, which we do all kinds of crazy things with, which, most of them are pretty good. I guess I should say crazy things. But what's really interesting to me is it says he entrusts these 3 servants with different sums of money, with different of his resources. And then it says, after that master was gone for a long time, he returns. And I think that's the point, because they're talking about the coming of the Son of Man in chapter 24. But then in chapter 25, it's like, well, if he's gone for a long time, you need to remain faithful throughout that entire period, right? So he's coming soon or not, right? And either way, our command, our duty to him, our whatever you want to call it, our life is to remain faithful, in both circumstances. So,
and the waiting period extends longer than individual lifetimes.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I think that's the hard thing for us. It's the hard thing for us to say, well, I want my conclusion to be the good conclusion.
Right.
But that's nor not only is that not a promise that your conclusion,
Right.
like the final conclusion is a good one if you remain faithful. Like
Yep.
that is good, but your earthly time doesn't, it doesn't mean like, oh, I'm going to make it to 80 years old and then Jesus returns and I never die. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
and it's glorified. Like,
Right.
no, we don't know what's going to happen. We know there's going to be a time of
Yes.
suffering. We know it. It's prophesied in
and
Revelation.
there has been, yeah,
There has been,
yeah,
and it will continue until Christ's return.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
it's good, and it's hold on.
That's right. I know this was a tough one. I hope you guys stuck with us through it. I love Daniel. It's interesting. Of course, this is the kind of stuff that the history stuff is what really kind of jazzes me a little bit. So.
Well, I think it's great, and I think we haven't in the last 100 years. There's been we've had the world wars. We've had a little bit longer than 100 years, but there's been a lot of turmoil. We haven't seen a lot of these things where nations totally get flipped. Like where we get, and so
or kingdoms, as you're saying, yeah.
kingdoms are flipped, and so. It's hard for us to, I always think about, man, like the anxiety you would have during this time of like all of these things, but kind of going that this is what we experience, the wars of nations and all that stuff. This is not new. I think this is a great example of that.
Although tell people in Cuban 52 or tell people in, the pre-revolution Iran,
you're absolutely right.
For them, the things did flip.
Yeah, well, it's the fall of the USSR and so forth.
Exactly. There have been those things happen during our life, but it doesn't affect us directly, I guess.
Right.
But
most Americans have not experienced a lot of that directly.
Right.
There are plenty of people that have immigrated that have, but.
And there are things even going on now that things are changing. Again, it depends on where you are, not only in the world but also in history, I guess is what we would say.
Yeah.
But the message is the same. The kingdom of God continues to remain. So
we just need another book of Daniel to spell everything out for us, don't we?
If only.
So
stay tuned to the Bible Bistro. That's.
We're just going to start saying kings, and this king's going to do this. And
no, we're not.
No, we're not. This is Prophet Brian. Just kidding. I'm kidding. Don't be wrong. I'll stone you. All right. So anyway, well, Brian, thanks so much for sharing Daniel 11 with us and giving us a look at the history and how this is all playing out. And I think this is great to give us that context that I think that we need as we're reading scripture to kind of understand how God is working, what's happening in here. And, as we kind of go like God sees what's happening here. He's telling his people there's coming a time, there is a savior that's coming.
Right.
So thanks so much.
Yeah. Appreciate all the listeners out there. Those who are still here after an
hour of talking. So we appreciate it. And all your support as well. So thanks so much, Brian. And I'll see you next Tuesday.
All right. Bye.
Bye.